Right, we're off again. Whiskey Dram number 38 this time. So this is the one that will actually end the current run of bourbons, although it's technically not a bourbon. I'll get into that into a second. But this particular whiskey and me have a bit of a history, and I will put my hand up and say I have been an absolute whiskey snob about this particular one. I have a massive thing against this, or I did have anyway, until recently when I was doing research and I was kind of joining some Facebook groups and talking to various people about it and thinking, do you know what, I've actually been unfair against this particular whiskey, simply because I didn't like anything that it stood for. It was a bit like being a music snob where you're going, oh well, you know, I hate Coldplay because everybody likes it. I was exactly the same with this bastard thing, Jack Daniels. I didn't like what it stood for. I didn't like the fact that its logo was everywhere on t-shirts. Everybody had a metal plate, tin sign on the wall at university. Everybody was asking for it. To me, it wasn't a bourbon. To me, bourbon was made in Kentucky, and this was from Tennessee, so that couldn't be a bourbon because all bourbon comes from Kentucky. Not true. It didn't say bourbon on the label, so it wasn't a bourbon. Not true. It wasn't as good as other bourbons, and therefore it was shit and mainstream, and it tasted rubbish, but everybody were idiots because they were drinking it. Don't know if that's true because I've not tried it yet, and I haven't had this in years because I have flat out refused to drink it. As far as I'm concerned, I should be drinking better things, but it's part of the challenge. It's in there. It was a miniature, was donated by my next door neighbour, who I'll put a picture of up now. She also donated the Aaron. She had one of these lying around. She donated that as well. So, you know, thank you, Helen, and I'm hoping that this is going to surprise me because for years I have dissed this and refused it and told people to fuck off if they wanted to get. No, I've not actually told them to fuck off, but I've basically politely declined it. When I was working at the whiskey shop, my parents-in-law used to buy me Jack Daniels nearly every Christmas because I worked in a whiskey shop and therefore I drink whiskey, and they'd seen that and they knew that, so they'd buy me that, and I'd have to grin and say, oh, thank you very much for the lovely present, and then just not do anything with it and give it to somebody else. But it is one of the biggest selling brands in the world, if not the biggest selling whiskey in the world. So it must have something about it. It is a bourbon. It is made in the same process as bourbon. It is 51% corn. It uses the same processes. The only difference with this to ordinary bourbon, you know, bourbon as we know it, is that once they've gone through the whole process before they put it in cask, they then filter it through maple charcoal. Now it's a 10-foot stack of sugar maple charcoal that's ground down into a stack, and they filter the whiskey through it. Now charcoal is, try and get the words into the right place. Charcoal is a material that has the biggest surface area of any other material. If you look at charcoal under a microscope, basically it's folds and folds and folds and folds and folds. So in terms of surface area, a little cube, say like that big, will have thousands of square meters of surface area within this cube because everything's so folded and tightly packed around each other and doing all of this. So it's a fantastic thing to filter through, because as you pour it through, little microscopic particles that you wouldn't necessarily see would be swimming around in your spirit, get kind of caught up in the layers of the charcoal, and just a cleaner spirit comes out the bottom. So that's why they do it. Now, I used to argue that filtering process meant that it wasn't bourbon, and it sort of is and sort of isn't. You can do that with bourbon, but Jack Daniels decide to market it as a Tennessee whiskey. It is their marketing decision not to call it bourbon, essentially to differentiate themselves from everything else on the market. It's similar to why some American whiskies don't spell whiskey with an E. The main reason for people spelling whiskey with an E is to differentiate themselves from Scotch, because Scotch didn't use the E, and back in the day it wasn't actually a particularly good product, so if you wanted to give the impression that you were a better product, you spelt it with an E, and that's why a lot of American whiskies do and Irish whiskies do, because they would differentiate themselves from the Scotch. Japanese tend to spell it without the E, Canadian as well, because as they were bringing products to the market, Scotch whisky was much more popular, much more highly regarded, and Irish and American wasn't so well regarded, and the quality was perceived as being poorer, so that was spelt with the E. Right, we'll spell our whiskey without the E. It's these daft sort of little things. So Jack Daniel's is a bourbon, and it isn't a bourbon, because Jack Daniel's don't want you to think it is a bourbon. So hopefully we've cleared that up. In terms of Jack himself, this is water by the way, not gin. Jack himself was born Jasper Newton Daniels. Now, there is a little debate as to when he was actually born, because officially, or according to the marketing, he was born in 1850. Now, the Tennessee State Library has records of his mother dying in 1847, so it's pretty difficult for him to have been born in 1850. So we're probably looking at about 1845, 1846. Now, he was one of 13 children from his father, but the youngest of 10 from his mother. And she died in 1850, so it was a really young age. And apparently he hated his stepmother, and he ran away from home, and ended up getting brought in by a lay preacher and a moonshine distiller, and caught up the distilling process of making moonshine. When his father died in 1875, he got quite a large inheritance from his father, and that enabled him, with the lay preacher, I think his name was Dan Call, that enabled him to set up a distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee, and I'll put that map up there of where the Jack Daniel's distillery is now. Now, a little bit later on, he managed to buy some of the land around it, which is where the spring was, where he then had the water to be able to make his whiskey. Now, on the label, you'll see in the middle of the logo, it says Old Number 7. Now, the distillery is in Moore County, which rather weirdly at the moment is a dry county, meaning that you can't actually purchase alcohol in there. So it's made in a county where you can't actually buy the whiskey itself. Now, there is a little kind of sub-law in terms of distilleries within Moore County are allowed to sell one version of the commemorative release. So they actually have whiskies on rotation. So they'll sell number 7 in kind of the old style bottling when it originally came out, and then they'll rotate it with another commemorative bottling or Gentleman Jack or something like that as a special one-off. And that enables them to sell their whiskies inside Moore County in the distillery. That's the only way you can sell it. So you've got to drive out of Moore County to buy Jack Daniel's, where it's made. So anyway, the Tennessee county boundaries basically had to register the distilleries, and Moore County had 15 distilleries at the time when registration was taking place, and Jack Daniel's was listed as number 7. Now, a few years later, they changed the boundaries of the counties, and it was re-registered, and it became number 16 in the district. So it was number 7 in District 4, and then they changed the boundaries, and it became number 16 in District 5. But by that time, he'd already got quite a good reputation, and hence kind of calling it Old Number 7, because it had been sold as a number 7. This is the number 7 distillery in this district. Because it had got a good reputation, people were looking for the number 7. He was calling it Old Number 7 to say, yeah, it's still us, we're just a different number. So, here we go, because it's been, like I say, it's been years since I've drunk it. I've dissed it, I've battered it away, I've turned my nose up at it, and it's not fair. I shouldn't do that, but I hold my hands up and say I've been an idiot. So we'll see how it goes. Now, it's a decent colour as well. It's not too dark, and there's a nice golden hue to it. Really nice kind of like, yeah, kind of goldeny browny colour. Very, very nice indeed. Now, on the nose, it is not rough, but it's harsh, and I'm willing to bet that there's a slightly higher rye percentage in here. It's pretty edgy. Now, one of the things I've never really been fond of is the fact that, and it doesn't do it on this miniature, but I'm sure it, oh no, it does on the miniature, because it says it's a Tennessee whiskey, and in the middle of Tennessee whiskey it says sour mash. Now, sour mash is such a horrible term because it doesn't even sound attractive. What they mean by sour mash is when they're making the mash to begin the distilling process, they actually use some of the solids from a previous batch and they put that in to help with the fermentation process. And it's standard practice across all bourbon, across a lot of whiskies that they use this. But having it on the label, it's such a clunky term and it's not particularly attractive that if you're looking at the label going sour mash, sour, it sounds a bit rough and a bit harsh and a bit not particularly pleasant. And then you go that, it's like, oh God, actually, yeah, no, it doesn't help. It doesn't help matters. But there is a sharpness to it and a harshness to it, and almost a petroliness to it. Yeah, there's definite kind of a petroly vibe to it, and it's not particularly pleasant. However, we will keep pushing ahead. I've got to give this a chance. Now it's very, very smooth. Very, very smooth in the mouth. But as you swallow it, pings you at the back of your throat and it kind of explodes. But there's actually quite a nice, juicy sweetness to it. And I'm trying to think what it reminds me of. It almost reminds me of rhubarb and custard sweets. Yeah, it's like a rhubarb and custard sweet, like those hard candies you get, where one half's pink and the other half's yellow. And it's rhubarb and custard. It's kind of a sweet richness to it, but it's quite juicy. There's not a great deal on the actual mouth. All the flavours there when you swallow, but you get this kick. Now it's still only 40%, but it's a kick at the back of the throat that's, I would have suggested, was more than 40%, more like 45, not 50, but more like 45. But the rhubarb and custard in this is quite there. It's quite pleasant. Fortunately, there's no feel of that petroliness that's on the nose, which is definitely still there. But actually, I'm not enjoying it that much. It's not completely turned me around. It's still not a great whiskey. It's still not brilliant. I can see why people want to mix it with Coke, but I would rather buy another whiskey and drink the whiskey on its own rather than go, well, you've only got Jack Daniels, I'll have it with Coke. But I can see why it's so popular with Coke, because it's got enough of a kick to kick through something like Coke, and then a sweetness to give you a nice flavour that's going to support the Coke there. So as a cocktail, it's absolutely fine. But I would not really want to drink this neat. It's kind of a banana-iness as well. Yeah. Rhubarb and custard sweets, and then those foam bananas that you get, the really nice soft ones. It's not as bad as I thought it was. I have been quite harsh on it. But it's not brilliant. But it's done. Okay, there you go. It's okay. It'll do with Coke. Right. Well, that's me done for tonight, and I shall see you at the next one. Take care.